Hey groups, it is week 4, quattro as my daughter would say in her dual language magnet elementary school. We're going to hit up our rhythm that we've been doing, read, think, pray, live, and continue through Scripture and charting this kind of overhead narrative look at Scripture and who God is. So we've covered some kind of key components about creation, God creating all things, and then we got through last week talking about sin and the fall and what that means and the brokenness that comes from there, and then we're kind of continuing on. And I'm going to jump to chapter 6 in Genesis and hit on a subject that kind of begins to make things difficult for Christians as we look at things like the flood, like all that means in terms of the devastation that was brought on humanity, and God basically saying, man, I can't believe that this happened, that humanity is, living this way and making these decisions and being sinful, and I'm going to wipe them out. And what I want us to think about tonight is remember that we're looking at it from the context of the narrative of Scripture, so the whole story of God, and looking at it through the lens of what we know to be true about who God is. And when we do that, it really changes how we read into and understand these passages, because it really helps us know and trust in God's ability to be Lord of all. And it helps us to put our faith in Him and say, but this is who I know He is, and this is who I know God to be, and these are the things I've learned to be true about God, and these are the things that God says. These are the covenants that He makes with His people. And when we look at it through that way, it changes everything. It helps us to be more hopeful, and it also helps us to recognize human responsibility in the midst of all these things, and that there's consequences to our actions, and there's consequences to the reality and presence of original sin, as we've talked about. So just keep those things kind of in mind. And as you're talking today, and especially asking questions about the passage, just help remind each other that this needs to be a safe place. So if someone has questions about, or these things are frustrating or concerning to you, that's okay. It's okay to say, I don't understand this. What does this mean? It's beautiful to wrestle with those things, because that is how our faith grows and how we really understand who God is, and He becomes more and more real to us, and the faith that we have becomes our own. So wrestle with those things and know that God's big enough to handle the questions. It doesn't take long reading through Job to recognize that God is a God who is okay with questions. And He'll let you know things like, where were you when I created all of the heavens and the earth? And He'll remind you of His infinite wisdom and love and grace and ability to create, and your finite ability to understand and reason and know about the things of God. So there's that tension. But I want you to read Genesis 6, 5 through 8, and then 15 through 22, and talk about a few questions. And reading it, knowing this too, we're broken, and brokenness is entered into the equation, and this is God's kind of first step to really bringing about this desire to redeem and restore. Because post-fall, once Adam and Eve are out of the garden, God's posture is one of getting back to the way things were. And this is kind of an initial step of, and I wouldn't even call it a do-over, because that makes it sound like God made a mistake, because He didn't. And that's the part of recognizing human freedom and all these things. So it's broken, but we have to look at it again through the lens of the promise and of the covenant that we know hasn't happened yet as we march through Genesis. It comes later in chapter 15 with Abraham. But it's there, and we know that that's where God is moving toward. So I want you to make a list of things that you know to be true about God. So just as a group, make a list of, just make a list of what you know to be true about God, what you've learned about God in Sunday school, from your parents, whatever. Answer these questions that follow, and read the passage through this lens of what you know to be true about who God is. So here's some questions. Why did God know the best and only response was the flood? So there's your first question. Why did God know that the best and only response was the flood in that moment, in that time? How does God sending a flood look different when we look at it through the lens of promise and what we know to be true of God? So knowing that God is love, knowing all the things we know about God, especially through who Jesus is and what He's come to say, knowing that Jesus is, the full representation of the invisible God. How does this change how we see the flood? And does humanity change after the flood? How or how not? So do we as humans, our nature, the things that we do, does that change after the flood? How or how not? And again, this is a safe place for you to ask questions. And as you pray today, spend a few moments kind of checking your heart and talk to God about a situation in your life that you may need to look at from the lens of promise instead of brokenness. For me personally, real quick, I've had to change and reconfigure how I look at things, especially in relationship to my sister and her new husband. And so some of you know the background of that. They're both addicts, and they're doing incredible. God is doing great things in their life, but God's working in ways that are different than maybe what I would think should happen. And so I've had to shift that, and I've had to have the Lord help me know where I've sinned and fallen short to really see Him at work in the lives of others, especially my sister and her new husband. So pray about a situation in your life where you may need to ask forgiveness, confess to the Lord. That may be an area of sin, so pray about that, and maybe you want to share that with your group. And finally with Liv, go through the questions and talk about those as a group. And man, I hope you guys are enjoying the journey together. Again, if there's any other questions that come from this that you guys are struggling with as a group, email me, email Brian, call us, feel free. And man, I hope this is a safe place. And as a group, just commit before you start answering questions. Commit to not try to tie a nice little clean bow around it, because that's not the case, and that's not going to happen. And part of that is this journey. But if we know this is safe and this is a place where we can talk about these things and know that others are wanting to journey with us and find more and more who God is and how we can grow in relationship, then we're more willing to ask questions and journey together. So I hope this is good. We're praying for you guys as you meet. And man, I love you all, and I'm so grateful to be on this journey with you as your pastor. Peace.